Right, let's just jump straight into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking one of the most intense, nation-breaking tug-of-wars in all of American history, the epic collision between states' rights and federal authority. Now, we're not just talking about some dusty squabble over political paperwork here. This was a defining, explosive conflict that completely reshaped how everyday people viewed power, freedom, and the literal purpose of their government.
So I really want you to keep this question in the back of your mind as we go. Who actually gets the final say? Is it your individual state, or is it the nation as a whole? You know, for folks living in the United States during the mid-1800s, this wasn't just some theoretical debate for a bunch of politicians in Washington. It was a profound, deeply personal moral crisis that would literally tear the country in two.
Okay, here's our roadmap for today. We're going to hit the core conflict, the constitutional tug-of-war, the nullification crisis, slavery as the ultimate breaking point, biblical morality, and finally, why education absolutely needs morality. Let's get to it.
Starting off with Section 1, the core conflict.
To really get a handle on this, we've got to establish the baseline. What exactly were the North and South arguing about? Well, it boils down to states' rights. That's the belief that each state holds specific, inherent powers that the federal government literally cannot touch. Southern leaders firmly believed they had the absolute right to write their own laws, especially when it came to the institution of slavery. Meanwhile, the federal government is increasingly passing these broad laws affecting everyone, laws directly challenging slavery. You can probably see the friction already, right? When Washington says, we're setting national policy, and the states reply, you actually have zero authority to tell us what to do. You've got the perfect recipe for a massive collision.
Moving right along to Section 2, the constitutional tug-of-war.
Now, what's fascinating here is that the rule book itself, the U.S. Constitution, actually built the arena for this massive fight. It's like a giant constitutional trap. On one side, the South leaned heavily on the 10th Amendment, which basically says any power not specifically given to the feds is reserved for the states. They use that to fiercely defend their lawmaking independence. But on the flip side, you've got the North leaning hard on the Supremacy Clause. And that clause dictates that if state and federal laws ever clash, federal law wins out, period. So if Congress tried to ban slavery in a new territory, a state couldn't legally ignore it. The South saw that as a direct attack on their sovereignty, while the North saw it as literally the only way to hold the country together.
All right, Section 3, the nullification crisis.
You know, back when the U.S. was first founded in the late 1700s, this tension was already there. But early on, they managed to patch things up. They'd argue over taxes or trade or setting up a national bank, and then they'd find a compromise. But as time marched on into the mid-1800s, the stakes got so much higher. The era of easy political handshakes, that was totally over. The conflicts were escalating dramatically.
And we see that boil over in 1832 with the nullification crisis. This was a massive turning point. South Carolina gets hit with a federal tariff law they absolutely hate. So what do? They claim they have the right to nullify it, to just pretend it doesn't exist within their borders. This was an incredibly bold test of federal authority. President Andrew Jackson wasn't having any of it, though. He literally threatened to send in the military. South Carolina ultimately backed down, but wow, what a glaring warning sign. It was the ultimate test run, and it completely foreshadowed the sheer violence that was just around the corner.
Which brings us to Section 4, slavery, the breaking point.
See, political compromise works fine for taxes, but when human lives are involved, that's when you hit the breaking point. Just look at what was at stake for both sides here. For the South, their absolute deepest fear was that if the federal government could ban slavery in new territories, they'd eventually ban it everywhere. And to them, that meant ruining their economy, their identity, their entire way of life. But for the North, their deepest fear was that if states could just cherry-pick which federal laws to follow, the entire Union would just shatter. For them, the very survival of the United States as a functioning democracy was on the line.
And that right there is exactly why slavery transformed a dry debate about constitutional rules into an explosive moral crisis. You can fix a dispute about a national bank with a new policy. You can't do that with slavery. It was tied to deeply held moral beliefs, massive economic systems, and core regional identities. Most importantly, it struck at the very heart of what freedom and equality actually meant in America. Because laws aren't just words on paper, right? They dictate the actual dignity of human beings. Once this urgent moral question took center stage, compromise became virtually impossible.
Let's shift gears a bit for Section 5, biblical morality and authority.
The source text for our explainer grounds this whole historical lesson in a really specific biblical perspective. It points us to 1 Peter 2:13, which says, "Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority." And this is a powerful reminder that authority and the rule of law absolutely do matter. As Christians, there is a clear calling to respect lawful authority, but, and it's a huge but here, we have to view that authority through the lens of justice. The massive takeaway is that human laws should never ever be used as a weapon to strip away the freedom and dignity of people made in God's image.
So, I want you to just take a second to really chew on this reflection question. How can people respect authority while still standing against unjust laws? It is such a tough, delicate balance to strike. The whole debate over states' rights and slavery proves just how incredibly dangerous government power becomes when it's used to protect injustice instead of fighting it.
And that leads us perfectly into Section 6, Education Needs Morality.
You know, this entire historical lesson really drives home why we need so much more than just raw facts and dates crammed into our heads, and this is exactly the core of the HeroesMart Academy philosophy. Education without morality will hurt. Think about those brilliant political minds in the 1800s. They were highly educated, they knew the law inside and out, they debated the Constitution like champions. But because they lacked a shared, uncompromising moral foundation about human life, all that intellect just steered the nation straight into a devastating, bloody war. Honestly, what's the point of being the smartest person in the room if you use that intelligence to make unjust choices that hurt people?
So, what's the actual fix here? Well, Romans 8:6-7 promises peace of mind to everyone who keeps their minds spiritual. And that isn't just some nice, fluffy thought. It's practically proven by those who live out this philosophy. True peace only happens when we actually align our intellect with our spiritual and moral values. You absolutely have to have a moral compass to guide your knowledge. Because without it, we just end up using our fancy educations to justify our own biases or worse, to defend the indefensible, just like the arguments used to protect slavery. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I'm going to leave you with one final thought to ponder. When human authority and moral justice collide head-on, will your education give you the wisdom to make the right choice? History has shown us the catastrophic cost of getting that answer wrong. So let's make sure that as we learn and grow, we aren't just leveling up our intelligence, but our moral wisdom too. That way, we actually know how to get it right. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and keep asking those big questions.